Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Locke. Welcome to another Gaffering Gear. Today we're having a look at the Aputure 60D and the Aputure 60x. So these are 60 watt light engines, daylight only and bicolor. They have lenses built into them, so they're convex lenses, so they're better than a Fresnel. And in today's episode, we're also going to be comparing these to the Dedolight DLD Turbo 7 because they're very similar optically. And we're also going to compare them to a cheaper alternative, which is the Nanlite Forza 60B. Okay, so let's have a look. All right, so before we get into reviewing, just the usual disclaimers, Aputure did send me this gear for free and I do get to keep it, but that doesn't influence my decisions on what I say, and Aputure don't get a say in the edit of this program. The next thing I want to point out, a lot of people get upset when I review Aputure stuff because I'm always the last person to review it, and a lot of you want to know what I think straight away. Here's why I'm the last person to review it. It's not the case that Aputure sends me gear late. That is not what happens. I review the equipment or test the equipment for review in the order that it gets to me. So when these arrived about 3 months ago, I had Kupo light stands and Kupo grips, gear that I had checked before, and I also had about 12 other lights that had come in for review. Now, of those 12 other lights, 8 of them didn't get on the channel, but it still took me a long time to test them to figure out that they weren't good enough. Anyway, let's get into the review. All right, so straight away, let's get into the negatives. Now, the first thing isn't really a negative, it's more of a wish. I wish these had DMX, particularly built-in lumen radio DMX. For me, if these had lumen radio DMX, I would sell my Dedo lights and buy 6 of these straight away, but they don't. So that's more of a wish. But here's the only negative I've got with the whole light, only one negative, and that is the cables that are supplied. So your V-mount batteries and your power supplies mount onto the yoke or onto the stirrup. And that's fantastic. I really do like that. I think that's awesome. But that's the only option you've got for mounting your power supplies and your batteries, because you only get a little cable. So what I would like to have seen is an extension lead between here and here. Okay, so that if I was using this on a magic arm or on a boom arm on a C-stand or just rigging it out on something, I'd have some option to get the weight of my battery off the light and further away. So that's the only negative I've got with the whole light. All right, so let's go through how much these things cost and what you get for your money. Okay, so the daylight version, that's the 60D, that sells for $369 US, and I've seen it advertised for 585 Australian dollars. The X, the bicolor version, is a little bit more expensive. That sells for around 420 US dollars, which is around 650 Australian dollars. Now, for some of you, that'll seem like a lot of money, and I don't want to come across as arrogant and say that it's cheap. It is, for a lot of you, that will be a lot of money. But to put it into some sort of perspective from a professional user's point of view, I think these are really, really cheap for what they can do, because optically they are comparable to a Dedolight DLD Turbo 7. Now, here's the thing. That light here, this light here, costs between 4 to 5 times more than one of these. So that is a substantial difference in price. Now, these are a little bit more expensive than, say, the Nanlite Forza 60B here with its Fresnel mount. These do come in at about 25 to 30% more expensive than those, but these have better optics. So we'll talk about that a bit later on in the video. Okay, so let's go through what you get for your money. All right, so in the bag is a Bowens Mount adapter. So you can use Bowens Mount accessories with this light. I'll probably never use that. Okay, you get a decent set of barn doors. So they're 8-leaf barn doors. So the side barn doors here, you can expand and contract them. So that's really good for controlling your light. And unlike the more expensive Dedo light here, these barn doors actually cut the whole width of the beam. So these are one of the most frustrating barn doors I've ever worked with. All right, now let's keep going through the kit. In terms of your battery operation, you can use, I keep forgetting what these batteries are called. MPF. You can use MPF batteries, 2 batteries to run the light, and this mounts onto the yoke or the stirrup on the side via the V mount here. Now, I can't test this because I've sold all of my MPF batteries, my MPF battery lights and battery chargers. So I've sold all that stuff. So I can't test this, but apparently you can run the light off one battery. at half brightness. So this does smartly communicate with the light, so it knows if there's one battery or two batteries on here. So that's a handy little thing for some of you. You also get a D-tap adapter cable, so you can mount a D-tap light or a V-mount light to the side of the light and power it that way. Okay, let's keep going through the kit. You get a power supply, which is in a little V-mount case here. So that's so you can mount the power supply to the side of the light, and you get a power extension lead or a power cable to connect to the power supply. All right, now you also get the light. Okay, the light's a fantastic build quality, I've got to say. This is all aluminium, amazing build quality. I'm really impressed with them. The lock-offs are really good. I can't really find anything to complain about. Actually, no, I can't. The one thing I'm not all that keen on is there's a little locker here on the top. So you've got to pull that out, push that in, sorry, to unlock it, or pull it out, I can't remember which. Yeah, pull it out and then push it back into lock. That makes more sense when you see the projection mount, which they'll be releasing soon. The next thing we'll talk about is fan noise. So the fan is mounted in this facing that way. Okay, so you don't have the fan blowing directly out of the top or directly out of the bottom. It's literally facing that way. So I was a bit concerned that maybe the housing would act like a trombone or something like that, but it's very, very quiet. I wouldn't say it's silent, but it's very quiet. Now, to give you some idea, the Nanlite Forza 60B here is the loudest of the three. The Dedolight here is the next quietest, and this is actually the quietest of the three lights. Now, before we get too much further, I just want to cover off the differences between the X and the D. Okay, so the X is bicolor. So you've got a range from 6,500 Kelvin at the top all the way down to 2,700 Kelvin. So you do have quite a bit of Kelvin range there. Whereas the D is daylight only. But the daylight only version does have some advantages. Number one, it is brighter. So at 3 meters, I measured this in at 42% brighter than the X. So the daylight came in at 1060 lux, the X came in at 745 lux. But the differences don't end there. Because this only has one set of emitters, it actually gives you sharper shadows. Now, in terms of the shadow sharpness, I can't see any difference between this and the actual Dedolight. The only difference I can see in the optics between this and a daylight version of a Dedolight is the range of flood spot. The Dedolight goes from 8 degrees to 60 degrees, whereas these units only go from 15 degrees to 45 degrees. So now we've got the difference between the D and the X sorted out. Let's just have a look at some bicolor options that are on the market. Okay, so we've got the Aputure 60x here, which is what we're reviewing today. We have the Nanlite Forza 60B here, which I thought I'd include because it's a 60 watt LED, so it gives you some idea of what's out there on the market. And if I don't include it, I know a lot of you are going to message me, so let's just get it out the way. And the DLED Turbo 7 bicolors. I own 6 of these. All right, so just getting straight into it, the Nanlite 60B does have one advantage over the other lights here, and that is you can take the Fresnel off and use it as a floodlight. All right, now having said that I can take that off, all 3 lights do have projection mounts, or by the time you watch this video or in a couple of weeks' time, they will all have projection mounts available. Now, I've got projection mounts for all of these, but I can't show you because some of them are still under non-disclosure agreements. All right, so the Dedolight has the best optics of the lot, but it is an absolute pain to use, particularly those little slider cutters. They're a nightmare. The Forza has a fixed lens system where you can, if you want to make your beam wider, you have to change the lens barrel out, but very good optics. The Aputure is the only one that has, and I will show you but not use it, a zoom spot. Okay, so this goes 15 to 30 degrees. Now, Aputure don't want me showing you this, what it can do, because they're not happy with it. This is a prototype, okay? So they've improved it since they made this. But this is the easiest to operate zoom spot I've ever come across. And in terms of its optics, it's the best optical zoom spot. It's quite heavy. It's the best optical zoom spot that I've ever come across as well. Now, I would give that thing a 9 out of 10, or maybe a 9.5 out of 10, and that's the prototype they're not happy with, so I can't wait to see what they're going to release. Anyway, let's talk about the brightness of these units and do a comparison. So this Aputure 60x came in at 745 lux. This is at 3 meters. The Forza came in at 744 lux, just 1 lux down, so pretty much identical. Now that is with the Fresnel mount on. I just want to point that out. And the Dedolight came in at 343 lux. Now here's something I want to point out. This is where a lot of information that's online is extremely misleading. Okay, so this is half the brightness, or well under half the brightness of that. Okay, but that's not exactly telling the whole story. This thing floods out to 45 degrees, whereas this thing floods out to 60. Now, if I compensate for that, if I spot up the Dedolight so it's 45 degrees, then the Dedolight spits out 516 lux. It's still not the brightest light out of the three, but it's not trailing as far behind as you'd think. It's only about 44% behind. All right, so let's do a bit of a shootout between these two. So we're mainly going to focus on the optics, but one thing I do have to mention is there is quite a bit of difference in the color between the two of these. They're both set to 5,600 Kelvin. Now, the Aputure here is running at about 150 Kelvin under and very close to neutral hue. The Nanlite here is running about 400 Kelvin over and is green to about the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. But having a look at them both in flood, they're both very, very even beams. So I'm happy with both of those in terms of how they flood. Now, when it comes to barn door cutting, that's where the real difference is between the two. The Forza with its Fresnel optics has quite a bit of convexing, whereas the Aputure with its double lens system has a very straight barn door cut. Now, the Forzas also have a lot of bleed from their barn door cuts, whereas the Aputure has an extremely clean edge on its cuts. Now, where the Forza does have an edge over the Aputure is in its spot capability. The Aputure spots down to 15 degrees, whereas the Forza goes all the way down to 10. All right, now let's get into a shootout between the 600X and the Dedolight DLED Turbo 7. Now, this is going to be very interesting because this light costs 5 times the amount of money. Now, that is not the DMX version, that's just the bicolor battery version. All right, so let's do a bit of a shootout here. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that there will be a bit of a color difference between the two. The Aputure is closer to correct, it's about 150 Kelvin under. The Dedolight is about, I think it's about 300 or 400 Kelvin over and very, very pink. So let's have a look at the flood. So both units flood very well. The Dedolight has a more even flood, only slightly, not much in it. And of course the Dedolight does have a wider beam of 60 degrees versus 45. All right, so where these units get interesting is when you barn door cut them. Now in the barn door cut here, you can see that the Aputure is actually sharper than the Dedolight. Now that might come as a surprise that this is actually sharper than the world-renowned Dedo optics. Now, I have a suspicion as to why that is because I've taken one of these apart. Over the light emitters on these, there's a silicon diffuser. Now that silicon diffuser is there, I'm guessing, to mix everything together as one light source. Now, the Aputure doesn't have that, and as a result, it does have a nasty side effect. If you do a very, very fine barn door cut, you can actually start to see the color emitters in the light. Now this becomes very obvious when you do a 45-degree barn door slash. Now with the Dedolights, you don't get anything like that anywhere in their optics at all. But how come I didn't put this at the start of the episode as a negative for these lights? Well, here's why. If you make the skinniest barn door cut that you can with a Dedolight and make the skinniest barn door cut that you can with the Aputure before you get this artifacting and put the lights the same distance from a wall, the barn door cuts are almost an identical size. So it's not really that big a disadvantage over a Dedolight because they're both pretty much identical in terms of the cut angle. Now let's quickly go over how to operate these, and I'm going to use the bicolor one to demonstrate because that is the most difficult of the two to use. Now the bottom knob is your flood spot, so that's pretty straightforward. Just give it a twist and it spots, twist it the other way and it floods. So it is a little bit sticky when you first get them, but they do wear in. So I think after a couple of times you've used it, the lubrication spreads around the corkscrew a bit easier. So the best way to explain how the flood spot feels is if you're an older gaffer like me, it's like an ENRO 2K blonde, how they used to feel. All right, so the knob closest to me, that's your CCT. Okay, so you've got 2,700 up to 6,500 Kelvin on the bicolor, and you can adjust in 50 Kelvin increments. Now the other knob, if you press that in, you can jump to Kelvin presets. Now this knob also is your intensity. So if you turn it slowly, it goes in 1% increments. If I turn it quickly, it jumps in 10% increments. Now to get into the menu system, you just press the menu button here. And first up is CCT, that's your white mode. Next thing down is your effects. Now you've got a whole heap of effects here. I'm not going to bother going through them all. So you've got your traditional things like paparazzi, explosion, things like that. All right, so I won't go over those. Next one down is your dimmer curve. So your dimmer curve comes in useful when you're using the Sidus Link phone app. You can determine how it dims. And the last thing is Bluetooth. So in the Bluetooth mode, you can set the light up so it operates to your mobile phone account or your Sidus Link app account. So that way no one else can accidentally use your light if you're shooting in close proximity to somebody else. And that's essentially the light. The only thing I've missed here is the on-off switch. So very, very simple to operate. Now one thing I forgot to mention is in the top right hand corner of the screen is your battery remain time. Okay, so let's go over all the technical data I've collected on the 60X. I've taken readings at every single Kelvin you can dial in. Let's start off with Kelvin accuracy. Now between 2,700 to 3,000 Kelvin, it is typically accurate to minus 42 Kelvin. Between 3,000 Kelvin and 4,000 Kelvin, it is typically accurate to minus 85 Kelvin on average. Between 4,000 Kelvin and 5,000 Kelvin, it is typically accurate to minus 124 Kelvin on average. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Kelvin, it is typically accurate to minus 159 Kelvin on average. And above 6,000 Kelvin, you're looking at an average accuracy of minus 225 Kelvin. Now one thing I will point out here is Aputure state that this thing gets up to 6,500 Kelvin. I didn't get near 6,500 Kelvin. The highest I could get was 6,219 Kelvin. Now let's have a look at our color render scores, and here I've measured TN30 color vector results. Between 2,700 and 3,000, the average score was 93.7. Between 3,000 and 4,000, the average score was 94.5. Between 4,000 and 5,000, it was a constant 94. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Kelvin, the average score was 93.45. And above 6,000 Kelvin, the average score was 92.7. Now, anything above 90 is a good score. Now let's have a look at our average color hues. Now ideally we want 0 color hue. Now color hue is how pink or how green the light is. Now I've measured this in delta UV to give you some idea of scale. 0.0024 delta UV is roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Alright, between 2,700 and 3,000 Kelvin, it was out by typically plus 0.0022 delta UV. Which means on average it is green to the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. Now between 3,000 and 4,000 Kelvin, it was out by typically plus or minus 0.0010 delta UV. Between 4,000 and 5,000 Kelvin, it was out by typically minus 0.0011 delta UV. And between 5,000 to 6,000 Kelvin, it was typically out by plus or minus 0.0003 delta UV, which is quite an achievement on a bicolor light. Now let's take a closer look at some of our kelvins, but before we do I just want to show something. I'm using a new graphic to show the white point accuracy of the lights. So inside this oval shape here is a cross, that is the white point of the light. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3140 Kelvin with a TM30 color vector score of 95%. The SSI score was 86%. Here are the individual CRI scores. Only R9 and R12 were below 90. Here is the wavelength analysis. And the light was off the Plankien curve by plus 0.0009 delta UV. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4298 Kelvin with a TM30 color vector score of 94%. Here are the individual CRI scores and only R12 is below 90. This is the wavelength analysis. And the light is slightly pink by less than a 1/8 gel correction with a delta UV score of minus 0.0016. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5473 with a TM30 color vector score of 93% with an average 100% color saturation. The SSI score was 75%. Here are the individual CRI scores and only R12 was below 90. This is the wavelength analysis. And the light was only just off pure white by minus 0.0003 delta UV. Now let's have a look at the results for the 600D, and I took 3 sets of readings, one at 100% brightness, one set at 50% brightness, and one set at 25% brightness. At 100% brightness, I got 5697 Kelvin with a TM30 color vector score of 93% color render with an average 101% color saturation. The SSI score was 73%. Here are the individual CRI scores. Here is the wavelength analysis. And the white point was staggeringly accurate, just missing pure white by only plus 0.0003 delta UV. At 50% brightness, the light came in at 5707 Kelvin with a TM30 color score of 93% with an average color saturation of 101%. The SSI score was 73%. Here are the individual CRI scores. Here is the wavelength analysis. And the white point of the light was off the Plankien curve by plus 0.0008 delta UV. At 25% brightness, the light came in at 5700 Kelvin with a TM30 color score of 93% with a 101% average color saturation. The SSI score was 72%. Here are the individual CRI scores. Here is the wavelength analysis. And the light was very close to pure white with a delta UV score of plus 0.0005 delta UV. Now, I almost forgot, but I also tested these lights for flicker using a slow rolling shutter camera with a shutter speed of a 1/17,760th of a second and couldn't find any evidence of flicker. Now that's the 60X and the 60D done. Next week's episode will either be on the Nanlux dynos or the Nanlite projection mounts, depending on what happens. See you next week. All right, now I got in touch with Aputure yesterday and said today that I'm going to start filming your episode. Is there anything you want me to cover that no other reviewer has spoken about? And they said, Andrew, can you please explain to everyone why the light is slightly green when it's at 2700 Kelvin. Now, in order to do that, we need to talk about the CIE diagram here. So the CIE diagram represents all the colors that the human eye can see. Now, in the CIE diagram here, there's a curved line. This line is called the Plankien curve. This line represents what the human eyes or the human brain perceives as being white light. Now on that line you can see all our Kelvin numbers. So one end of the line is warm white, the other end of the line is cool white. Now here's the thing you notice, that line is in a curve. Now anything just off that line but above will have a green hue. Anything just below that line will have a pink hue. So here's the problem. The Plankien curve is a curved line, and a bicolor light tracks in a straight line. So you've got a light like the 60x, for example, that has a color emitter that's 2700 Kelvin, and at the other end it has a color emitter that's 6500 Kelvin. You fade between those two color emitters to adjust your Kelvin point. But because there's only 2 points, it tracks linear. So it goes beneath the line, which makes it pink. So here's the problem a company like Aputure has when they make a light. They have to decide where to place the two emitters, the 2700 and the 6500 Kelvin emitter. Do they place them directly on the line so that they don't have any color hue? Well, if they do that, that means that when you dial in 3200 Kelvin, you're going to be very much below the line and very pink. And if you dial in 5600 Kelvin, you're also going to be below the Plankien curve and very, very pink. So the next option is to have your ends above the Plankien curve, which means they're going to be slightly green, have a slightly green hue. And then try and target the crossover point at 3200 Kelvin and 5600 Kelvin, which are our two most common colors. So basically the fact that the light is slightly green at 2700 Kelvin is actually a good thing. That means that when you dial in 3200 Kelvin, which is your more commonly used Kelvin, it will be accurate.